She had seen the world, from the grand stages of Hollywood to war-torn countries as a humanitarian. Angelina Jolie had witnessed the best and worst of humanity. She had achieved fame, fortune, and influence that millions could only dream of. But behind the camera flashes and red carpets, there was a silence in her heart that no award or applause could fill. She was searching for answers, for peace, for something deeper than what the world could offer. And then, in the quiet moments between chaos, she picked up a book she never expected to hold so close to her heart. A book filled not with stories of fiction, but with timeless truth. The Quran. At first, it was simple curiosity, a verse here, a line there. But then came one verse that stopped her. It didn't just make her pause, it made her weep. Her hands trembled, her heart pounded, and tears streamed down her face in a way they hadn't for years. This verse wasn't just written, it was spoken directly to her soul. It was as if God Himself had reached out through time, space, and language to say, "I see you. I know your pain. And I am near." And in that moment, everything she thought she knew about God, about faith, about life, began to shift. She had seen religion as something distant, strict, sometimes cold. But this verse radiated warmth, compassion, and intimacy. It didn't demand perfection, it offered mercy. It didn't condemn, it comforted. The words spoke of a creator who listens, who heals, who understands even the tears you don't show to the world. It was as if her soul had been waiting for this moment her entire life, and now that it had come, she couldn't let it go. So she read it again and again. Each time, the meaning deepened. Each time, the tears returned. Not from pain, but from the overwhelming realization that she was not alone, that beyond the noise of the world, beyond the hurt and questions, there was a peace waiting to embrace her, and all it took was a single verse. This wasn't about conversion or headlines. It was about connection, about truth, about finding something that finally made sense in a world that rarely does. That one verse didn't just change her mood, it changed her heart. It awakened something pure, something eternal, and from that day on, she was no longer just Angelina Jolie, the actress, or humanitarian. She became a seeker of truth, forever marked by the beauty of one divine message. She sat alone in her room, a copy of the Quran resting gently in her lap. It had been given to her by a friend she trusted deeply, someone who had once said, "If you ever feel lost, read this, not to be changed, but to understand." For weeks she had left it unopened, unsure of what she might find, unsure if it would speak to someone like her, someone who had been through pain, conflict, and the noise of global attention. But tonight felt different. The world outside was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to listen. Not to people, not to media, but to something higher. She flipped through the pages slowly, letting the unfamiliar text breathe in her hands. And then her eyes landed on a verse. There was nothing particularly dramatic about its position on the page, no bold colors, no footnotes. But the moment her eyes fell on the words, something inside her shifted. It was as if the verse reached through the paper and gently touched a part of her soul that had been long forgotten. The words spoke of God's closeness, His knowledge of our inner struggles, and His endless mercy. It felt personal, direct, as if this verse had been waiting for her all along. She kept reading the same verse over and over, not to memorize it, but to absorb it. Each time it felt new, like a soft whisper to her heart, reminding her that her pain, her questions, and her doubts were all seen. It wasn't a message of judgment, but of understanding. She had carried so much on her shoulders. grief from her mother's passing, emotional scars from her journey through love and loss, the overwhelming burden of being both admired and misunderstood. But this verse didn't demand her to be perfect. It only asked her to remember that God was near, and that was enough to bring tears down her cheeks. This was the beginning of something she couldn't quite name yet, but it felt real. Not a performance, not a public gesture, just an honest, quiet moment of truth. The verse didn't change her public image, it changed her heart, and that made all the difference. She had traveled to places many would never dare to go. Refugee camps, conflict zones, forgotten corners of the world. She had heard the cries of the oppressed, held the hands of broken children, and witnessed suffering that shattered her spirit more times than she could count. For years, she carried those images with her, unable to forget them, even in her dreams. And through it all, she kept asking one question: where is God in all of this? That question had haunted her, especially as someone constantly surrounded by privilege and luxury, yet deeply aware of the pain that existed outside of it. She had explored many paths: philosophy, humanitarianism, even silence, but nothing truly answered that aching question in her soul until she read that one verse. A verse in the Quran that didn't ignore suffering or cover it with flowery words. Instead, it acknowledged it with grace. It reminded her that even in pain there was purpose, that God wasn't distant or indifferent. He was near, closer than we realize, listening even to the cries we're too exhausted to voice. The verse struck her differently than any speech, book, or belief system she had come across before. It didn't pretend to erase hardship, it honored it. And in doing so, it gave her hope. Not the kind that denies pain, but the kind that walks with you through it. That realization brought her to tears once again, not because she was weak, but because for the first time she felt like something, understood her heart without her having to explain it. She began revisiting that verse each night, not as a ritual, but as a refuge. Whenever she felt overwhelmed by the state of the world or burdened by her own emotions, she would turn to those words. And every time, they met her where she was. No judgment, just peace. That one verse started opening doors in her heart, doors she thought were long closed. It wasn't about religion in a traditional sense. It was about connection, about discovering a creator who doesn't ask you to have all the answers, but simply to remember him. And in that remembrance, she started finding the healing she never thought was possible. She wasn't searching for a new religion. She wasn't looking to convert, impress, or even change her identity. What she was looking for, deep down, was understanding. A reason behind the emptiness that lingered no matter how much she gave, achieved, or traveled. Angelina Jolie had long been admired for her strength, her courage, and her heart for justice. But few knew the quiet battle she faced behind closed doors, the sleepless nights, the restless soul, the silent question: why does it still feel like something's missing? The verse didn't come to her with a grand speech or dramatic moment. It came during a quiet pause in her life, when the cameras weren't rolling, when no one was watching. She had opened the Quran out of curiosity, not expectation. Yet what she found was a verse that spoke to a part of her soul no one else had ever reached. The words weren't loud, but they echoed deeply. They spoke of mercy, of divine understanding, of a God who is not angry and distant, but patient, forgiving, and close. She found herself crying, not out of sadness, but relief. All her life, she had been carrying this unspoken fear that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't good enough for God. that her past, her mistakes, her questions had pushed her too far from grace. But this verse told her something entirely different. It told her that Allah knows the weight each heart carries, and He does not turn away from those who are broken. Instead, He invites them closer. Each night, she began to reflect on this verse. It became a mirror for her thoughts, her regrets, and her hopes. She didn't tell anyone at first. This wasn't for the media. This wasn't for applause. This was for her healing. And what amazed her most wasn't just the message, it was the feeling that came with it. A strange, beautiful calmness, a sense of being seen. For the first time in a long time, she stopped running. She stopped pretending to have all the answers. And in that stillness, in the quiet companionship of a verse from a book she once knew nothing about, she began to feel whole. Not because she had figured it all out, but because she had finally allowed God into the space where words could no longer reach. The verse stayed with her like a quiet melody, soft, constant, and unforgettable. Angelina Jolie, known for her fierce independence and humanitarian fire, had spent years searching for something deeper. She had read hundreds of books, spoken to religious scholars, meditated in silence, and wandered through the philosophies of East and West. Yet nothing had touched her heart the way this one verse from the Quran did. It didn't scream for attention, it didn't demand belief, it simply whispered truth. And that was enough to move her. She kept going back to it, reading it again and again, sometimes in tears, sometimes in stunned silence. Each time it revealed another layer. The words carried mercy, not judgment. They carried healing, not shame. They felt like a hand reaching into the storm within her, offering stillness. It was hard to explain it to anyone, even those closest to her. How could she describe the feeling of finally being understood by something divine? This verse shattered so many misconceptions she had unknowingly carried for years. Misconceptions about God being angry or distant. Misconceptions about religion being rigid or harsh. Instead, she found softness. She found the idea that God is not waiting to punish, but is always ready to forgive. That He is not far, but nearer than our own thoughts. It was a new world, and it began with a single verse. As she explored more of the Quran, she noticed a pattern. Verses that uplifted the broken, honored the sincere, and reminded people that no soul is beyond hope. It was vastly different from what she had expected, and the more she learned, the more she realized that Islam wasn't about fear. It was about peace. A kind of peace the world couldn't offer. Her nightly routine began to change. She would sit in a quiet space, light a candle, and read that verse before sleeping. It became a moment of grounding, of surrender. Not to a set of rules, but to a presence she could finally trust. The verse didn't change her overnight, but it opened her heart. And once a heart is open to truth, everything starts to shift. Angelina had found something rare, authentic connection, and it all began with one verse that met her at the edge of her loneliness and gently pulled her back to light. As days passed, that single verse continued to transform Angelina Jolie from the inside out. It was no longer just a line from a holy book, it had become a lifeline. In moments of doubt, she would return to it. In moments of exhaustion, she would reflect on its meaning. There was something about those divine words that reminded her she was not forgotten, not abandoned, and certainly not alone. For someone who had spent a lifetime holding the weight of the world on her shoulders, this felt like the first time she was being held instead. She started noticing changes in the way she looked at life. The chaos that used to consume her didn't have the same power anymore. Fame, pressure, and the spotlight faded quietly into the background. What mattered now was the state of her heart. That verse taught her that being close to God isn't about perfection, it's about sincerity. It's about returning, even if you've been distant. It's about asking, even if you've been silent. It's about crying, even if no one else understands why. Angelina began to study more about Islam, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of love. The deeper she went, the more it made sense. She learned that mercy is one of the most repeated themes in the Quran, that forgiveness is offered even before we ask, that guidance is not forced, but gently presented. These weren't just words to her, they were medicine, a healing she didn't even know she needed. People around her started noticing something different. There was a calm in her presence, a softness in her responses, a clarity in her purpose. She didn't preach, she didn't post, she simply lived with a new kind of grace. And at the center of it all was that one verse that had become her quiet companion. It reminded her of who God truly is, not the angry figure she once feared, but the most merciful, the most loving, the one who knows every tear before it falls and every heart before it breaks. This realization changed everything. It gave her permission to begin again, to breathe, and to believe in the possibility of peace. What started as a moment of curiosity had become a journey of transformation. One verse, one heart, one truth that changed her forever. There was something deeply personal about the way that verse stayed with Angelina Jolie. It wasn't just a moment of reflection, it became her mirror. Every time she read it, she saw herself a little more clearly. It was as if the verse was written for her, waiting patiently all these years, just to be discovered at the right moment. It didn't demand change. It simply invited her closer to the truth she had always longed for, but didn't know how to reach. For someone who had traveled the world and witnessed the pain of war, hunger, and displacement, Angelina had seen more suffering than most. But she had also seen the strength of the human soul. What touched her in Islam was not just the verse itself, but the spirit behind it. The message that no matter how heavy the past is, there is always a way forward. That God doesn't hold grudges, He holds hope. She began to carry that verse with her like a shield. Not in a dramatic or public way, but quietly, intimately. It became her prayer in the moments no one saw. It guided her thoughts when she faced difficult choices. It softened her heart when the world felt too harsh. And over time, it began to show in the way she spoke to people, the way she raised her children, and the way she viewed herself. What surprised her most was how gentle Islam truly was. The compassion, the understanding, the emphasis on intentions, on kindness, on privacy and dignity. These values echoed her deepest beliefs, and they all seemed to shine through that one verse. It was a verse that didn't judge, it welcomed, it didn't punish, it promised mercy, it didn't separate, it united her heart with something eternal. Angelina had once feared that turning toward religion might take away her identity, her independence, or her creativity. But the opposite happened. She felt more like herself than ever before, more whole, more grounded, more at peace with the woman she had become. That one verse, simple yet powerful, had done what years of searching couldn't. It connected her to something beyond this world, something real, something divine. And in doing so, it gave her the courage to embrace a faith that honored the very best of who she was and who she could still become. And so, what began as a quiet encounter with a single verse became a life-changing journey for Angelina Jolie. A journey from questions to clarity, from searching to finding, from fear to faith. It wasn't about headlines or public approval. It was about healing, about truth, and about the kind of peace that only comes when the heart finally meets its creator. This story isn't just about a celebrity embracing something new, it's about the reminder that no matter who we are, where we come from, or what we've been through, one verse, one moment, one connection with the divine can transform everything. It teaches us that Allah's mercy reaches every soul that seeks Him. And sometimes, all it takes is a whisper of guidance to awaken a heart. Thank you for watching this video and joining us on this emotional and powerful journey. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more real and meaningful stories that open minds and soften hearts. Until next time, may peace and guidance find you in the most unexpected ways.